to be refreshed in our memories that indeed Jesus Christ was instrumental in the creation. All things were made through him, and there wasn't anything made that hath been made except through him. So we want to exalt our Lord, our Savior and the Son of God this morning by a study of this lesson. I don't believe we could have chosen a better person than Brother Kyle Butt to do this. Kyle is a graduate of Freed-Hardeman University, having received a bachelor's degree in Bible and Communications, and then to further his knowledge, he acquired a master's degree in New Testament studies from Freed-Hardeman University. He is the author or co-author of 20 books. That's a rather remarkable accomplishment for a gentleman no older than he is. He is the editor of the Discovery magazine. Of course, all of us know that Brother Dave Miller is now the director of the Apologetics Press work in Montgomery, Alabama, and Kyle is one of his co-workers there, and they work hand in hand. We're thankful to have Dave in our midst this morning. We're looking forward to hearing him tonight. But Brother Butt not only is the editor of Discovery magazine, but he is the associate editor of Reason and Revelation. Many of us are on that mailing list and acquire that paper, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I think it's an excellent, excellent paper. And if you are not getting that, you need to see Kyle or Dave One and subscribe to that publication. Kyle is frequently asked to conduct seminars on similar topics as the one that we have given him. He's a strong believer in the creation account found in the book of Genesis. He is certainly in opposition to the blasphemous theory of evolution, and we're so thankful for men like him. He has recorded several of his seminars on DVDs, and these are available for you to order if you would be interested in doing so. And the place to order DVDs is right out the foyer to the left down the hallway, and you'll see tables there for that. He and his wife Bethany have 3 children, and he presently resides in Montgomery, Alabama, as I've already mentioned. Kyle, this little box here is the timing box. So many people have kidded me about that box. It used to be blue, but now it's black, and I don't know who painted it black, nor do I know their reasons. But maybe it means doom and gloom, but in this case it doesn't. Brother Kyle Butt, we're happy to have you to speak on Christ and the creation.
From what I understand about this box, it is now constructed of the material that the black boxes on airplanes are constructed. So if this building blows up, that black box will still be here clicking until 38 minutes is over. When I am invited to speak on a lectureship like this, I am humbled because I know for a fact that there are men in this auditorium who are listening to me who have been preaching the gospel for longer than I've been alive. I know for a fact that there are women in this auditorium who have been reading and studying their Bibles and who have born children who are older than I am, who have taught them more Bible probably than I'll ever know. I take this opportunity not lightly whatsoever, and I'm humbled by it. But I also believe that the Lord puts people in places providentially to do certain things. I don't know why He does that. I don't know how all of His majesty and power comes to play in putting people where they are. But as I stand before you, I believe that providentially I'm here to deliver to you a message that potentially can change your life forever. And that's what I hope to do this morning. You know many of the verses that discuss Jesus Christ being the Creator. If you were to start in Hebrews chapter 1 and you were to listen to the writer as he said, God who at various times and in different ways spoke through the prophets to our fathers in times past, has now spoken to us through His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom He made the worlds. You see, lots of times it's difficult for us to get our minds around the concept that Jesus Christ was here eternally. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, we read that Jesus Christ Himself says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, says the Lord, the first and the last, who is and who was and who always will be." Eternal, never created, always has existed, as was so adequately propounded to us this morning in the class. Deity. And in the stress of Jesus' deity is also the stress that He was the Creator. That at the very beginning, before time even began, Jesus Christ was intricately and masterfully bringing this creation into existence. When you go to John chapter 1, the passage that is the substance of this discourse, you listen to John say that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Through Him all things were made that were made, and nothing was made without Him. Now, just as an aside, some people suggest that Jesus Christ was a created being, that Jesus Christ was not eternal, that Jesus Christ is not deity. But if that passage is true, that nothing was made that was made without Him, if Jesus Christ was made, then that passage simply could not be true. If it says that all things that were created through Him, then that would necessarily mean He couldn't be a created being. And He certainly is not. When we go to Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, we read that He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over creation. And that word firstborn does not mean that He was born first, that He was created first, and then all creation was created after Him. It means that He is the preeminent, the utmost, the very top. And then as you read, it says, because all things were made through Him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. He made everything. When we think of Jesus, many times we think of Jesus as a person in His bodily form, walking on the streets of Galilee, sitting by the well, talking to the woman there in John 4. We see Him sleeping on a cushion in the bottom deck of a boat. We see Him passing out pieces of bread to 5,000 men, not counting women and children. And it is difficult for us to realize that the being that was housed in that physical body was the very same one that when you go back to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's Him. In the beginning. When He prayed in John chapter 17 verse 5, Father, glorify me with the glory that I had with you before time began. It's the same God. The same God that you see in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke and in John, walking among His creatures. You see, there is an idea. And the idea today that this world didn't need a God to create it. In fact, a man by the name of Charles Smith, taking his first statement from Genesis chapter 1, has made this statement. In the beginning was matter, and matter begot the amoeba, and the amoeba begot the fish begot the amphibian begot the reptile begot the lower mammal begot the lemur begot the monkey begot the man who imagined God. Thus is the history of man. You see, there's an idea out there that our world came into existence through blind processes. Something supposedly 13.7 billion years ago, a tiny ball of matter the size of a period, actually about 1/6 the size of a period at the end of a sentence, exploded in something that many people in the scholarly world refer to as the Big Bang. This explosion somehow brought everything that we see into existence, and it caused all of the order and all of the complexity and all of the intricately put together pieces of this universe. Now, as you well know, that idea is simply a trumped up falsity that is designed solely to do away with the Creator God. And we can show that that idea is ridiculous. But I want you to understand that the reason that many people hold on to that idea is because it's the only alternative to the concept that God, Jesus Christ, the Father and the Holy Spirit, they were responsible for creating this world. But you see, once you say that there is an intelligent personal being who's responsible for creating the world, then that means if that intelligent personal being created you, then you're not free to do whatever you like. That you have moral responsibilities and obligations to that personal, intelligent, all-powerful Creator. But because people don't want those obligations and responsibilities, they've chosen to build for themselves the idolatrous, ridiculous idea of evolution. Now, when you start to poke holes in this idea, you can see it cannot hold water. It's intellectually unsound. If you were to ask the simple question, okay, you're suggesting to us that there was a tiny ball of matter about the size of a period at the end of a sentence. Have you ever seen a ball of matter that could explode and bring something like this universe into existence? When they are forced and pressed to answer that question, they would say, no, we've never seen that. Why in the world would you suggest it? Well, because the only alternative is a God. You say, okay, just a second. You say that there's a tiny ball of matter, 1/6 the size of a period at the end of a sentence, that exploded and brought this universe into existence. Can you tell me, please, where that initial ball of substance came from? Can you tell me where we got that? They talked to Dr. Alan Guth, who in 1981 was responsible for putting several key ideas in the idea of the Big Bang. They said, Dr. Guth, where did this pre-inflationary model come from? He said, well, it's tempting to suggest that it came from literally nothing. Literally nothing. Now, folks, you and I both know, and I'm not trying to insult your intelligence here, but if there ever was a time where there was literally nothing, what would you have right now? You would have nothing. You can't get something from nothing. It's an impossibility, both logically and physically. It's a ridiculous idea, absurd to the highest degree. And when they asked Dr. Guth about this pre-inflationary model that was tempting to suggest that it came from literally nothing, he said, oh, well, it would have been amazingly small. Only would have been about 10 to the negative 20 centimeters across. And he said, also, it would have only weighed about 25 pounds. You've got something that came from literally nothing that was amazingly small and would have only weighed about 25 pounds. Folks, that simply doesn't make any sense. If there ever was a time when you had nothing, you would have nothing now. One of the biggest problems that the evolutionary community has with their cosmology, the big word they give to origins, is that they can't get the original substance. But now let's look at what the original substance is supposed to have brought into existence. Supposedly that tiny ball of matter, 1/6 the size of a period at the end of a sentence, exploded and brought this universe into existence. If we were to ask, how big of a universe you got to have? I mean, how much force, how much power, how much energy and matter did that tiny ball of matter bring into existence, supposedly? Now, this is granting for their sake that you could even have it. You can't get it. They don't know where you can. They say from nothing, but that's absurd. But even just granting it to them, okay, let's say you've got the little ball of matter that you can't get. It's got to bring the universe into existence. If I were to ask you how big is the universe, You might understand that if you went to something like Psalm 19:1, the heavens declared the glory of God and the firmament shows His handiwork, you would understand that there's something awesome about the universe. So awesome that if you were able to wrap your mind around it, then it would demand that there is an all-powerful Creator. One of the things that is so awesome about the universe is its sheer size. You see, for many years we didn't understand the size of the universe. The size of the universe. For many years we thought that the universe was much, much smaller than it actually is. People would go out into the night sky and they would try to count the stars, and they would suggest to all of those who read their materials that the stars that you could see were the extent of it. That was all there was. Hipparchus in about 150 BC said there are something about, I think he said 1,005 stars. He had gone out on a clear night and counted them using his unaided eye, and he came up with that number, and he suggested that that's all the stars that there are. Tycho Brahe counted 777 stars. Kepler, just a few years after Brahe, said, no, there are several more than 777, and I think he counted 1,056, somewhere around there. If you go down to Walmart and buy a cheap telescope, you can look out into the night sky and you can see literally thousands and thousands of stars. If you spend a little bit more and get a bigger telescope, you can see tens of thousands. If you have access to something like the Hubble Space Telescope, you can see tens of millions. And in every direction you point that telescope, you will see stars beyond the tens of millions that you can recognize, and you know that there are tens of millions more. In fact, they suggest to us that in our single Milky Way galaxy, one galaxy, there are 100 billion stars. The Sun is a medium-sized star in our Milky Way galaxy, and you can put 1 million Earths inside of the Sun. And you can put several thousand suns inside of several of the larger stars that we have seen. So we live in the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy has 100 billion stars in it. The Sun is a middle-sized star in the Milky Way galaxy. Do you know how big of a number 100 billion is? I mean, if you just wanted to count to 100 billion, start counting 10,000 every single day. You know how long it takes to count to 10,000? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, we're certainly not going to waste our precious time counting to 10,000 this morning. That would certainly defeat the purpose. You know, it takes a long time just to count to 10,000. You know how long counting to 10,000 every single day it would take you to get to the number 100 billion? It will take you 27,353 days or so. 27,000 years, rather. 365 days a year, counting to 10,000 every single day, 365 days a year, it'll take you 27,363 years or so to count to the number 100 billion. And that's how many stars are in our Milky Way galaxy. But wait. It's kind of like one of those paid programming commercials. Not only do you get this, but that's just one galaxy out of the universe. You know, not only can you look through that Hubble Space Telescope and see stars, but you can see tens of millions of galaxies. Do you know they suggest to us that there are 100 billion galaxies, the same number as the estimated amount of stars in each galaxy. So you have 100 billion stars in each of the 100 billion galaxies. So if you were able to count to 100 billion, taking you 27,000 years just to count the stars in one galaxy, then you'd have to start over just to count the galaxies in the universe. It's no wonder that the text says the heavens declared the glory of God and the firmament shows His handiwork, because the more you look into it, the more you realize that there has to be something bigger than anything that anybody's ever thought of. And you say, well, okay, those galaxies. I mean, how far do they span? How big is the universe? Like I said, we live in the Milky Way galaxy. Suppose that you had the capability of putting yourself in a spaceship that would go the speed of light. Now, the speed of light is the fastest thing that we know. Some people have suggested that some type of short radio waves go faster, but there's never been any conclusive proof of that. The speed of light is about 186,302 miles per second or so, somewhere around there. It goes around the equator 7 times in a second. That's how fast light travels. Now, suppose that you could travel the speed of light, which is about 586 quadrillion miles every single year. A light year is how far light will travel in a single year. Suppose you could travel the speed of light. You started on one end of our Milky Way galaxy, and you decided you would go to the other end. How long would it take you traveling the speed of light to get across our one galaxy? 100 years? You'd be dead by then. Most of us would be dead if we got in a ship going 100 years traveling the speed of light. But that wouldn't get you anywhere close to the end of our galaxy. 1,000 years. Nowhere close. 10,000 years. Multiply that by 10. It would take you 100,000 years traveling the speed of light to get across a single galaxy. Our nearest neighboring galaxy for a long time we recognized was the Andromeda Galaxy. There are several much smaller galaxies now that are a little bit closer. The Andromeda Galaxy, if you wanted to travel there going the speed of light, it'll take you 750,000 years. That's 586 quadrillion miles a year. If you wanted to travel from one side of our universe to the other, they estimate, which they have no way of knowing because we don't have any type of instrument that'll let you look across the entire galaxy, but they estimate that it would take you 20 billion light years. That's traveling at the speed of light. It'll take you 20 billion years to get across our galaxy. Now, how'd that get here? A tiny ball of matter the size of a period at the end of a sentence? Folks, you and I both know that that's absurd. It's ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't accord with the scientific information that we've got. You would have to break every single known scientific law to get that tiny ball of matter explosion to work. You would have to break everything we know biblically to get that to have come into existence without a personal God. It defies everything we know as the truth. And it simply cannot and did not and could not have happened. And when we think about Jesus Christ being the creator of that, you know, it's remarkable to look at some of the miracles that Jesus did when the disciples were in that small Galilean fishing boat. And they were being tossed to and fro by the waves of the sea. And from what I understand, the Sea of Galilee, many times a storm could just come up out of nowhere. You wouldn't know where it came from. It could be very, very violent, sometimes even deadly. The apostles are there on that boat with Jesus Christ. The waves are pouring over the sides. The apostles honestly think that this is their very last night on this earth. They think they're going to die. They rush down to Jesus. Now think about this. Jesus said one word in Genesis chapter 1 verse 15, and all of the hosts of heaven were created. You understand that? It's hard for me to. But the man who was sitting in the bottom of that boat was the being who at the very beginning said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The being who was responsible for creating every one of those 100 billion stars and every one of those 100 billion galaxies. Jesus Christ brought it into existence. Do you think for one second that if the apostles had understood who they had in their boat and the power of the word of this man, that they would have thought, this man created all 100 billion galaxies, but he's going to die in a storm on the Sea of Galilee in a tiny little province of Judea? No. If they had understood the power of Jesus, they would have never thought for one second. So Jesus tried to show it to them. When He said, "Oh, you of little faith," He walked up on top of the deck, and in something that would be remarkable to us humans, of course, we wouldn't have any possible way to know how a being could do this, but He said, "Peace, be still." And the entire Sea of Galilee, as big as it was, obeyed the what? Peace, be still. 3 syllables that He spoke. I don't know how many there would have been in Aramaic. 3 English syllables, we'll say. Jesus brought the world into existence. And the apostles were amazed that He could stand on a boat and on one small sea tell the wind and the wave to be still, and they obeyed Him. If they had known that the entire universe obeys the voice of Jesus Christ. Almost the entire universe obeys the voice of Jesus Christ. You know, there's some aspect of the universe that doesn't. You know, Jesus could say to the wind and the waves, "Peace, be still," and they would stop. Jesus could sit on a small grassy hill, and He could take from a young boy 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And He could start pulling that apart. You know why He could do that? In Genesis chapter 1, you get down to day 3, and you see God, through Christ, saying to the world, "Let there be grass and flowers and trees." And so on day 3, there were all kinds of flowering plants and grass and trees. And the Bible says that they brought forth after their kind, which we have a little bit of information about that. As far as, let me digress just a little bit and we'll get right back to that point. But according to the theory of evolution, somehow in the distant past, by random chance processes, non-life gave rise to life. And then somehow over multiplied millions of years, that life changed from different kinds of life into different kinds of life. The problem with this idea is that it flies in the face of everything that we know scientifically. Scientifically, there is a law that every single one of us recognizes. It's called the law of biogenesis. Bio, of course, meaning life. Genesis meaning the beginning. The law of biogenesis says this, that every time you see life in this material universe, it came from previously existing life of its own kind. For many hundreds of years, people didn't understand that. In fact, they thought that it was scientifically disprovable. And as evidence, here's what they said, spontaneous generation is actually the case. Spontaneous generation is the idea that life can spontaneously generate out of nothing. That you don't need previously existing life, you can just get life from nowhere. It can just pop out of the chemical properties of the air or the minerals or whatever it is that are mixing together. They said, yes, as proof of spontaneous generation, if you will take a T-bone steak and slap it on your kitchen counter in the middle of the summer and leave the window open, in 2 weeks you can come back and you'll have life spontaneously generated on that T-bone steak in the form of little worms, maggots. That was in the 1400s and the 1500s. In 1600, a man by the name of Francisco Redi said, well, I'm not sure that maggots spontaneously generate. They said, they certainly do. That wasn't their only evidence for the fact of spontaneous generation. They said, in fact, if you will take an old sweaty rag and you will put it in the corner of your barn, if you will come back in about a month, it will have spontaneously generated life. The chemical properties of wheat and sweaty rags happen to bring forth, almost invariably, mice. They spontaneously generate out of the chemical properties. If you will take a piece of wood that still has the bark on it, throw it in a wet ditch, come back in a month, pop the bark off of it, guess what has spontaneously generated all under the bark of that particular piece of wood? You have bugs and beetles and grub worms and you name it. You didn't see many of them or any of them crawl in there, and now they're in there, so how did they get there? They spontaneously generated. In about 60, a man by the name of Francisco Redi, which is something you'll read in every single standard science book that there is, said, you know what, guys? I just don't think maggots spontaneously generate from meat. And he did one of the most ridiculously simple experiments that anybody's ever seen. He put a group of jars over here with meat in them, and a group of jars over here with meat in them. And on this group of jars, he put a lid, hermetically sealed it airtight so that no air, nothing could get into those jars. And he left those unsealed. And he watched them. Very simply, flies landed on the sealed jars. They couldn't get into the meat. No maggots formed. Flies came over and landed on the meat in the unsealed jars. Maggots formed. He said, I believe that maggots are produced by flies. They said, oh, no, you've got a problem with your experiment. The problem with your experiment is that for spontaneous generation to actually occur, you have to have air mixing with whatever substance it is to bring about the spontaneous generation. The reason that maggots didn't appear on the sealed jars is because you didn't let air in. He said, okay, I'm going to add another element to this experiment. And he had another set of jars that he put gauze type, medical gauze, netting type substance on them. And he watched as flies landed on the sealed jars. Nothing happened. Flies landed on the gauze-covered jars, and maggots formed on the gauze but not on the meat. He watched as flies flew into the meat in the unsealed jars, and maggots formed on the meat. He said, voila, there you go. Flies produce maggots. Everybody said, wow, that's amazing. Do you think in 1660 that Francisco Redi thought that he had dealt the death blow to spontaneous generation? No. In fact, he still believed in spontaneous generation. He just believed that maggots didn't come from spontaneous generation. They came from flies, but other things spontaneously generate. For another 200 years, people believed in spontaneous generation until a man by the name of Louis Pasteur showed up onto the scene in 1860, about between 1862 and 1866 or so. He did several experiments. The experiments are immortalized basically for us forever on our milk cartons. If you were to go into your kitchen this morning and you opened that kitchen, you would see on the side of your milk carton that it is pasteurized. You would also see that on any type of natural fruit juice like apple juice or grape juice. Those would be pasteurized as well. Where did that word come from? Of course, from a man named Louis Pasteur, who was a brilliant scientist. He invented the vaccine for rabies and several other things. But Louis Pasteur did an experiment in the 1860s in which he had meat broth or hay broth that they would zoom in their microscopes to see the hay broth there. They would see millions of microscopic organisms in the hay broth. They said, well, how did those get there? They must have spontaneously generated. They must have popped out of nowhere. Pasteur said, no, they certainly did not. They just came from other microscopic organisms in the air that you just can't see. Here's how I'm going to prove it. He put them in a special flask, boiled them, and killed all the microscopic organisms. Left them in that flask with a special long S-shaped neck. At the bottom of that S-shaped neck was so well designed, the bottom was so well designed that it captured all of the microscopic organisms due to gravity, but allowed air to go back into the hay broth for all those people that said you have to have air for spontaneous generation to occur. They would watch the hay broth with that special S-shaped neck on it, and not a single microscopic organism formed. Even though the air was coming back in, they were all being captured in the crook of that S-shape. When he would break the neck off of the special flask, the air could come right back in, the microscopic organism would go back in, millions of microscopic organisms would form. He explained and showed that life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. Now, according to evolution, you had to have matter in the beginning. And then that matter had to somehow, in a process that no person has ever seen, and that, now get this, not only has no person ever seen, but for the last 150 years, the brightest minds in the scientific communities have been trying to prove happens. I just listened to a lesson called The Origins of Life that was presented by a company called The Teaching Company. The brightest minds, there are 500 of the most brilliant scientists in a group called ISOL that get together to try to figure out how to do an experiment to get life from non-life. It's not like we haven't come across this yet. We've been trying to get life from non-life for the last 150 years, and every single experiment shows it's an impossibility. And then not only do you have to get life from non-life, but somehow you've got to get that life to change into various different kinds of life, something that nobody has ever seen. You understand the law of biogenesis. Here's what it means. If you have a dog and it gives birth to babies, every time you look at those babies, you're going to have baby Well, you're going to have, obviously, sometimes you're going to have half dog, half cat. Sometimes you're going to have 99% dog, 1% hippopotamus. Sometimes you're going to have 99.999% dog, one scale, lizard. You ever going to get that? You're not ever going to get that. Why? Because you and I both know what every 5-year-old has known as long as he or she has been able to understand about animals. When you have a dog, it gives birth to a puppy. When you have a cat, it gives birth to a kitten. Folks, in Genesis chapter 1, when Jesus Christ brought forth plants and they multiplied after their own kind, that meant that every peach seed always produced a peach tree, and every peach tree always produced a peach. And every wheat grain always produced wheat. And when Jesus Christ was breaking that bread for the 5,000 men, not counting women and children, He was doing nothing more than He had done at the very beginning of time, bringing material into existence and conforming it to His will. That's how it's always been from the very beginning of time. Jesus Christ is the Creator.